Welcome back to Hero Goldberg. Today I'll be talking about Tradcon logic and how it functions. Now, I believe that all these men are well-intentioned, so it's not an attack on them. I do notice, however, a tendency where conservatives of the traditional stripes, they will complain about how stats are sallied forth in the mainstream, but then when they try to push back against it, they almost invariably obfuscate or just flat out distort and lie about what men are facing. So we have two different live streams here. I'm not going to go through them entirely because it would take hours, but the first is why Christianity is masculine. And you hear arguments such as real men want to submit to the king. You're a feminist if you don't need no man, which by extension means you don't need God. So you gotta reject feminism and be religious. Creatures naturally want to worship their creator, and Christianity is masculine because it's created by men. Even though I would disagree with that to some extent. Maybe the Old Testament, you could make that argument. The New Testament, there is considerable uplifting of even degenerate women. At least that was the message of Christ, that you can be born again, that you're not condemned because of your past life. And strangely enough, when I've interacted with other Tradcons, they tend to disagree with this. And they'll say, no, 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 even if I've had a checkered past, the woman has to be virtuous. Or they'll appeal to these older form of Christianity where all the women, they couldn't even be touched by man before they got married, which, as you'll see, is a common trend. If they can't deal with what's in front of them, they retreat to, well, that's how it was back in the day. That doesn't mean it's realistically applied to the present age. And Elliot Hulse, who is in the upper left-hand corner, he talks about Gramsci wanting to eradicate Christianity from the West and says if you don't have Christian patriarchy, you get egalitarianism. Once more, this is a little bit complicated because if you take the message of Christ specifically, unless it is integrated with a very strict faith administrative structure, both in the government and the church, it's not difficult to see how we've ended up in the present state of affairs. You know, the individual known as Adam No Eve, he doesn't upload a lot, but he's got some very interesting insights. He says Christianity is a religion for post-war women who want to feel better about themselves. And there's some basis for that, to be perfectly real. You are less likely to see a girl at the age of 21 being super devout in the church than a guy, especially nowadays. And that's because women have very little to actually benefit from patriarchy and traditional values. And yet a lot of churches, despite whatever past you want to appeal to, they have advanced this. They're very much about men and women are equal, and you have to be willing to accept the terms of the world as it is now, and not necessarily pledge to some past which may be more ideal, but once more, is it reachable? So now we turn to this why the marriage black pill is feminism clip. And it starts out with the British guy Nolan saying, most marriages, this is the argument, most marriages end in divorce, but if you talk to Dr. Thomas Sell, it's actually 14.9 out of 1,000, which is a very low percentage. I think it's a lot higher than that. I don't believe that stat. Obviously, we know people such as the fringe pill MGTOWs, TFM, they exaggerate and distort statistics because the audience is going to eat it up. That does not mean, however, that the divorce rate is as low as the conservatives want to pretend. And there's other factors you have to consider. I mean, I would say this is anecdotal, but if people I grew up with, they got married, I would say between 25 or 30% are divorced. Now, some have been married more recently, so you'd have to stagger it over 5 to 10 years. I would like to see a comprehensive study done, not comparing a marriage that ends this year with marriages that started decades in the past, but really staggered out over time to give us a superior picture of what precisely is occurring between men and women. But to say it's only, what, 1.5%, or that strikes me as far too low, at least based on what I've observed. Then we have Elliot here. He says, I think of getting married as being a rebel, like a punk rocker from the 80s, and you want to go the other way. You don't want to be like all those kids that are cutting off their genitals. Now, let's be realistic. How many kids are actually cutting off their genitals? That just seems like a boomer-con obsession. I'm sure there are folks identifying as LGBT, but are they really all taking a knife to themselves in record numbers? I suspect that is a distorted statistic. It's an example of what they don't like, which is these exaggerations of marriage not succeeding. But even if you look at Elliot, he talks about traditionalism, but then if you take a glance at his wife, she looks like a modernistic Karen, to be honest. Maybe I'm being too judgmental. Regardless, if you look at him, he very clearly did not come from a traditional union. And this is something I find kind of interesting, where I've mentioned before the Andrew Tates of the world, the Sneakos, who are the byproduct of a largely egalitarian, progressive social force, then turning around and saying we need traditionalism. But it's just like conservatism, which means less and less each year. It's like go back 10 years, go back 5 years. So you say, what exactly are you conserving? I mean, if you wanted to be that anal retentive about it, you could go back and say, hey, you shouldn't even be a Christian. You should be following like the animist religions of Africa or whatever. Again, I know this is probably being too overly restrictive, but I think it's striking how it works, where it's almost a need to rediscover tradition, but by the time you've reached that stage, tradition has changed in meaning dramatically. So next we have the guy in the bottom right-hand corner with the long hair. He says that James Sexton, the popular divorce lawyer on YouTube, is in fact a red pill grifter. I don't understand his logic there, because if you're a divorce lawyer telling people that most marriages don't succeed, how are you a grifter if you're warning them against that? Oh, but he's telling them to get a prenup, and that's casting a shadow of uncertainty. Well, but it might also be much better. It shows maturity, that two people can talk about it and not see everything as, oh, it's not true love, therefore it won't function. Because realistically speaking, you're not going to be super in love 20 to 30 years later. Very few people are. It becomes far more formalistic, at least from what I've seen. And he's claiming that the lawyer stat of 75% failing, if you incorporate those who are in cheaper to keeper unions, oh, he's exaggerating. Well, but you don't really address the problem, Tim. You just try to glaze over it and say he's a red pill grifter, but let's be real. Statistically speaking, even if marriages that fail, it's only 30% or 25%, but how many of the remaining marriages that are supposedly successful are built on the wrong foundations? Like the guy I talked about in the other video, the bald cell who watches his wife getting banged out, or another guy I know, a coworker, he said his aunt and uncle, who are very financially successful and married for decades, they have purchased a property where they can trade off on weekends screwing other people. Now that's statistically a successful marriage. It does not mean that it's a marriage you would probably approve of. So this is a good instance of them wanting to essentially agonize over a point, but not necessarily being honest about what's behind those figures. And as we'll see in just a second, it gets worse. In the upper right corner, Nick, he says he read The Rational Male, and Raleigh Tommaso is preaching this in your 20s, you got to get jacked and smash all these girls, and maybe in your 30s you can find a young trad chick to marry. This goes to a very common approach of Tradcon. Someone did it recently in the comments, and they said, oh, you guys who are degenerates and you're making these women lonely and then expecting virtuous ones. Well, I get it from the standpoint of the Rushian types, but really, I don't think Roos was successful with women. I think he did a lot of pay for play. But let's say guys in the early 2000s had an easier time of this. Men in the last 5 or 10 years are not smashing throughout their 20s and then getting married to a virgin in their 30s. This is a huge attempt to distract from the problem, which is the unleashed behavior of women. And they want to say it's the fault of men for being degenerates. Guys might want to believe they're doing that, so they follow these red pill channels, but most of them would be lucky if they have like an LTR in their 20s. Or maybe they can go overseas, but they're not doing, the average guy, the sub 5 is not doing that. No matter how you want to pretend and be like an old woman, oh, all these degenerate men who are pigs, they only want one thing. This guy says Rolly Tommaso can't be trusted because he's in fact married with 2 daughters. But is that a surprise? Take a look at Rolly. Do you think he's the type of dude who could spin plates? Most red pill types, when they hit middle age, if not sooner, they don't have the SMV or the money to keep women around. And that's why they have to settle for a single chick. This is what David D'Angelo did. I think Corey Wayne did the same thing. And who knows what the state of Rolly's marriage is? Is he happy? Is maybe his wife, is she with, on the side getting one of the other Manispherians? You have no clue. That trying to put that up as, oh, see, it's a sign of hypocrisy is really just nonsensical, because a lot of dudes project a lifestyle that they want to have, and then there's what they actually possess. It's not the same thing. But what he says is, if you look at the statistics, you have to consider that beef study related cancer and ask, oh, they just did this survey, but how many of those people were exercising? Or how many of them were smoking? How many of them were red pill? And the reason why stats are imperfect is because it's very expensive to collect accurate data. You have to ensure people aren't lying to you, that they're being consistent with their workouts, their diet, whatever. Even if you want to suggest, as he does, they should be getting the meat from the farm down the road, and this is a bit of a rabbit trail, but some years back, Sri Lanka tried to ban GMOs, which is considered red pill and based, and they had a huge collapse in their crop yields. There was an economic crisis, a political revolution. If you were to try to actually transition the United States to organic, no processed food, like many of these people probably would have as an ideal, you would create a holodomor. You would kill a lot of individuals, unquestionably, because the number of folks in this country who subsist off of highly processed food, preservatives, certainly frozen food, you have no clue. So the thing is that, yeah, it sounds great on paper, but if you're going to do it, it would require a lot of money and a lot of complexity, and still there would probably be some kind of cost in human life. That's why I'm saying that all these ideals are much easier if you're someone who makes good money and you can afford a lifestyle, but trying to transpose that on a larger scale is very difficult. Moving on, he says that I don't care if 99% of marriages fail, because I want to ask the question, how many of those marriages were between practicing Catholics or men who don't use porn or women who come from homes where there was a father? So this is a good example of the no true Christian, no true Muslim argument. Whenever you put forward a challenge to people that hold certain views, they'll just claim no one has ever reached the true epitome or apex of what it means to follow this religion or this lifestyle. Therefore, all of the contradictory evidence is irrelevant and invalid and can be discarded. Just like if you are religious, the burden is on the person who's not to prove otherwise. You don't have to actually justify anything that you think or believe because, well, I just believe it. Okay, whatever, that's a separate discussion. But this attempt, this revolt against reality, doesn't really help the bulk of men. How many people in the United States are Catholic? Not the majority. Now, of that minority, how many of them are anywhere close to Tradcon? How many men don't use porn at some point? How many women, even if they're coming from intact households where there's a father, you really believe that these Caucasian chicks that are on TikTok being degenerate, you think they're all from broken homes? No, there's plenty of fathers who have sacrificed and have shown absolute unconditional love towards their daughters, and it doesn't matter because this is simply female nature unleashed. When they have liberties, rights, freedoms, economic empowerment, this is what they do. So saying you need fathers in the household or you need men who don't watch porn or people that are Catholic is largely irrelevant because it's not reflective of most of society. So you can only really pull this off, as they're implying, in a very small, maybe homeschool-esque community. That's fine, but how is that going to help the average guy from a different background or a sub-5? How exactly is that benefiting him? Then Nolan, the British guy, picks it up again with the observation that women who earn more than their partners, that often creates a problem in marriages. Well, that's capitalism for you. It was an inevitability that they wanted more consumers and cheaper labor. So unless you can restructure, maybe go to your distributism or some kind of more sensitive economic system, this is going to occur. I've said this for years, and people want to keep going back to feminism, which is truly just a byproduct of the economic and to a certain degree the political system. But it's really economic because you can't practice political rights as effectively if you don't have money and the ability to separate yourself from those who would control your actions and behaviors. Noland explains that the popular stat of 51% of women being unmarried or not wanting to be married is actually exaggerated. It's closer to 25%. All right, fine. Let's suppose 75% of women, you have to take out the ones that are too old in the stat and too young. You've got this population. Of all those chicks, how many of them are going to come anywhere near the standards that the guy Nick was talking about in terms of being tradcath and coming from a household with a father? That's the first question you have to conquer. The British dude says, well, I'm on Instagram, all these women are saying, I don't want careers, we don't want all this feminism, we just want to be married. And that's fine. But how many of those females are prepared to accept the vast majority of the men who want to get married? I mean, you can go around this panel, Elliot Hulse, we call him, I don't think that's a Chad Drone. I call that maybe a Turbo Clarence. The guys on the bottom are decent looking. The one in the upper right corner, unless he's tall, I would say is basically normie. And this is the fundamental issue, because if women actually are complaining that they want to get married, it's not that difficult for them, all right? So they can start in their church. If they don't find someone there, they could try to cold approach men at the library or the coffee shop or the bookstore where all the good guys are. That's an old red pill joke. It's something that Pat Stedman was saying, but I guess he can't say it anymore because he's in jail. Oh well. If that doesn't work, the women can go on Hinge and say, heart on fire for Jesus, want a life partner, and they're going to find men. But will those men meet their standards? Like when I went to Rush's church, it was overwhelmingly young men there, and they're the types like 5'7", Caucasian, curly red hair, neck beard, glasses, orthodoxy shirt, that kind of thing. Normie dudes. Are they going to clock on the radar of these women who just want to get married so badly? I'm not certain. I can give you some firsthand experience. Last year I was doing the kind of LARP of investigating the mythical trad wife, not because I had much hope in it, but I don't like dismissing people without at least investigating what they're saying or arguing. And I visited a number of churches, including Orthodox and Catholic ones. I tried mainstream apps, I tried the Trad app, but even on the Trad app, well, you have to pay for it. So that means that there's a diminished pool of people that can actually get on there and send messages. I noticed any woman who was above a 6, they wouldn't even respond to you. It's just like normal dating apps. And even the 6s, you had to really be doing some form of cuck dancing to maintain their attention. So what you find is that even these supposedly religious women, first of all, many of them late 20s, early 30s, single moms, but even the ones that you'd say are somewhat ideal, they don't like the vast majority of men. And bear in mind, I'm over 6 feet, make well over 100,000, have 2 cars, have a house. Still, they're going by looks. It's not personality. So the best bet of one of these normie or sub 5 dudes is maybe they meet a girl in the church, they do the whole oofy doofy game, possibly. Otherwise, the picture is bleak. And telling men, well, you just need to get married anyway, I'll give credit to Nolan. He's running like a freaking matchmaking service, so at least he's trying to create a solution. But none of these guys, and maybe I didn't watch enough of the streams or their other content, I have not seen these guys seriously address the problem of female expectations being way overblown. And this includes religious women. If you think that Christian women are bad, Muslim women are worse by a factor of 10 in terms of hypergamy and demands from men. These are issues which can really only be resolved by a complete overhaul of society, including the state. It's not enough to tell people go to church. You have to change that stuff, and you have to limit the access women have to technology, especially smartphones, if you want to have this trad LARPing succeed. Otherwise, it's just going to be the same thing, which is people are going to try, and a lot of them will go down in flames. I grew up around many conservative religious people. That has not stopped them from getting divorced. It is just ecstasy for women to have the smartphone, to have all this attention. And until you have a real solution for that, this is all probably well-meaning. They're probably decent human beings, all these guys, but they are not addressing the core problem. You can blame men all you want for being imaginary degenerates or believing the red pill lies, but you're not changing the fact that a lot of this is female behavior extracted from the economic system and the new technology which we possess. And that is essential.